Well, welcome to our continuing journey with the Gospel according to John. And this week we're continuing experiencing the love letter that is the chapters that we find in John between the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane event. The authors of the Gospel of John put together these chapters addressing just the disciples. Not the Greeks, not the secular humanists of the day, but just Jesus' disciples. And so we talked last week about being the love letter. Well, this week we're dealing with chapter 15 and continuing into the first 4 verses of chapter 16. And there's 3 distinct thoughts in this material we're dealing with this week. The first one is in chapter 15, 1 through 11. It deals with the disciples' relationship with Jesus. And then in verses 12 to 17, it deals with the disciples' relationship to each other. And finally, chapter 15, verse 18 through 16:4, it has to do with the disciples' relationship with the world. So this week we're dealing with these 3 passages. Now, before we dive into these, let's remember that in 90 AD there was no organized church. Okay? All that existed were disciples that were committed in community with each other to follow Jesus. And at this point in history, when the gospel was written, the disciples were being persecuted by the Roman emperors because Christians refused to affirm the divinity of the Roman emperor. Because they refused to recognize Roman emperors as divine, they were being persecuted. That's the context for this chapter. First, the disciples' relationship with Jesus, verses 1 through 11. It begins with the final I am statement, and the I am statements are sprinkled through the Gospel according to John. And this I am statement is, I am the true vine. I am the true vine. You are my branches. There's 2 words in this passage that I want to unpack real quickly that are just interesting to consider. In verse 3, the word is translated cleansed, that the disciples have been cleansed. A more accurate translation is that they've been pruned. And so this word that's translated cleansed can also be translated pruned, which is more appropriate to the imagery of the vine and the branches, that they've been trimmed, they've been nourished through the relationship with Jesus. The other word that we need to look at is a word that's translated abide. For in verse 4 it reads, abide in me and I in you. Abide can be translated interwoven, becoming part of each other. And you see, the 2 entities, Jesus and the disciples, are one. I abide in you and you abide in me. We are interwoven. We are united with each other. United by divine love. The Word became flesh in me, and it continues to be in your flesh as my disciples. You see, The vine provides nourishment for the branches, and the branches bear fruit, which is the sign of discipleship that they bear fruit. Recall the message of the little book of James in the New Testament in the library. Faith without works is dead. That's the fruit that is made possible because as branches, we're connected to the vine. Now, how does this nourishment take place? Well, the church has talked about the means of grace through our tradition. How are we continually nourished? Prayer is a common form of nourishment. Meditation, study. The sacraments of the church are oftentimes referred to as the means of grace, the means of nourishment. But what is important to realize in this first message that we're dealing with this week is that the relationship of Jesus and the disciples is not a relationship of rabbi with students. No, it's closer than that. It's not a relationship of master and servants. No, it's closer than that. It's not even a relationship of divine with the human. It's closer than that. It's not two entities in relationship with each other. It is that they are one, unified by divine love. Christ abides in the disciples, and the disciples abide in Jesus. You can't be any closer than that. That's the relationship of Jesus and the disciples. Intimate, interwoven, connected, one and the same. Now, the second passage in verses 12 to 17 clearly states that there's a special kind of relationship between and among disciples. Verse 17 at the end of this passage puts it clearly, "This I command you to love one another." Now it's referred to as friendship. If you will, we're sort of joined at the hip with other disciples. That's very, very difficult. The word that's translated love and friend in this passage is not agape, it's philia. And philia is different. Philadelphia is a city of brotherly love. To get away from the gender reference, it's a city of sibling love. It's a city of friendship love. And Jesus uses philia to describe the relationship of Christians with each other. We indeed are one with each other. We are friends with each other. Now, quite frankly, this is really demanding. There are those disciples with whom we disagree. There are disciples with whom we have no eros, no emotional ties. But these differences, according to John, are always in context of what we have in common. And what we have in common is the relationship with Jesus. You see, we're all attached to the same vine, and the vine is greater than human differences. Now, 4 or 5 months ago, when we were studying Romans, we dealt with this in detail. And if you want to be refreshed, read Romans 12. Because that talks about this body of Christ connected to each other. Indeed, as disciples, we are friends with other disciples. We philia with other disciples. We're called to philia one another, to be disciples of the same vine. So we have Jesus' relationship with the disciples relationship with each other, and then from 5:18 through 15:18 through 16:4, we have the passage that deals with the relationship of the disciples with the world. Now, it set forth the reality that this book was written in 90 AD, 60 years after the death of Christ. The authors know what's happening in 90 AD. Christians are being persecuted by the Roman government because they will not state that the emperor is divine. The public having Christians persecuted, being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum, as are some of those stories that we remember about the agony of the persecution. And so for John, the world is represented by the Roman government, the government that governs that part of the world in 90 AD. And so when he said, the world will hate you because you are about the business of divine love, the world would choose to hate you because the world, as John represents it in this passage, are those that have denied the existence of God. Or another way of saying it is, the world are those who have a life without God. And you have a life with God as disciples with me. And that is over against those who live apart from God. And therefore, you will be hated by the world. The authors know that's true because it's happening to them in 90 AD. So we have these three profound messages in this love letter to the disciples. I'm the vine. You're connected to me. I abide in you. You abide in me. And that will give you the nourishment you need to be in relationship of friendship with each other, joined at the hip, and the strength to withstand the persecution that is coming your way from the world, who lives apart from God and therefore hates you for being of the divine. Plenty to think about. Plenty to have conversation about. And maybe these thoughts will help you on that journey of thought and conversation. First of all, as disciples, what are the most helpful and meaningful means by which you receive nourishment from the vine of Christ? Secondly, the ministry of reconciliation has been defined as living and working with those with whom we disagree. Why do disciples often insist on agreement as a prerequisite to unity? Finally, in what ways are disciples experiencing hatred from those who live apart from God in 2022? Enjoy the journey. We'll visit next week.